The greatest military upset of the Middle Ages began not with a king but with a lone, enraged man. His name was William Wallace, a Scottish nobody who dared to execute a royal sheriff in cold blood. This act of personal vengeance ignited a furious, hopeless war against Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, and set a trap at a wooden bridge that would change European history. The odds were 10-1. The defeat was inevitable, but no one saw the deadly 4-foot flaw in the English plan. The year is 1296. Scotland is a nation choked, its king deposed, and its sacred stone of Scone hauled away by Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots. His occupation was pure cruelty, English officials replacing Scottish justice, endless taxes, and a humiliating, suffocating presence that cried out for a champion. This void was too large for a duke or an earl to fill. It needed a figure of pure, uncompromised fury. That champion emerged not from the halls of Edinburgh Castle but from the rural gentry. Wallace was a man of relatively modest standing, yet he possessed an education and a physical presence that set him apart. His legend, the legend of the man who dared to strike back, was born not out of grand strategy, but out of personal, blinding vengeance. The incident that turned a man into an outlaw, and an outlaw into a national hero, occurred in the spring of 1297 in the town of Lanark. Wallace's dispute with English soldiers escalated into a riot. When the smoke cleared, the English sheriff of Lanark, William Heselrigg, had ordered the death of Wallace's wife. The result was undeniable. Wallace returned to Lanark, ambushed Heselrigg, and executed him in a public, savage act of retribution. This single act of blood elevated Wallace from a mere fugitive to a symbol of popular defiance. It was a fuse igniting a powder keg of national resentment. Wallace's method was simple and deadly: guerrilla warfare. Operating deep in the forests and highlands, his small band of followers used the terrain they knew intimately to launch devastating surprise attacks. This was a war fought not for castles, but for control of the roads, the spirit of the people, and the confidence of the occupiers. The great lords of Scotland dismissed Wallace as a dangerous radical, but the common folk saw a refusal to bow down, a hope reborn in fire. As the summer of 1297 progressed, Wallace's movement swelled, transforming from a band of outlaws into a force capable of taking on larger English installations. His success proved contagious, inspiring a parallel uprising in the north led by Andrew Moray, the son of a prominent Scottish noble. This convergence of two formidable rebel armies, one from the south and one from the north, signaled a profound change in the conflict. What started as individual acts of defiance was consolidating into a genuine, national rebellion. The outlaws had formed an army, and they were ready for a battle that would decide the fate of Scotland. The unified Scottish forces, now led jointly by Wallace and Moray, marched on Stirling, the symbolic and strategic heart of the nation. It was here, at the crossroads of Scotland, that the occupation would be tested. The English commanders, led by John de Warenne, Earl of Surrey, and the despised treasurer, Hugh de Cressingham, underestimated their foe completely. They saw Wallace not as a commander, but as a bandit who had somehow gotten lucky. They were about to pay for that arrogance with blood, for the stage had been set for a confrontation at a humble crossing over the River Forth, a confrontation that would soon become known as the Bridge of Destiny. But the English general saw a bandit, not a commander. That single mistake would drown his army. Here is the first call to action. If you're captivated by these moments where personal fury turns into national history, please make sure you hit the subscribe button right now to see more stories of incredible historical upsets. The English army arrives at the River Forth, a staggering column of professional soldiers, armored knights, and financial power, their banners stretching for miles. But they stop, not because of the Scots, but because of a simple, wooden bridge barely wide enough for two horses abreast. The Scots were waiting, not for a fair fight, but for a single fatal mistake. The site of the battle was strategically paramount: Stirling Bridge in September of 1297. It was the lowest crossing point on the River Forth, a vital gateway connecting the south of Scotland to the northern heartlands. The English host that gathered there was immense. Contemporary estimates suggest forces numbering close to 9,000 men, including 1,000 heavily armored knights. They represented the power and wealth of the greatest military force in Western Europe. Wallace and Moray, by contrast, commanded a force of perhaps 5,000 or 6,000 men, comprised mainly of foot soldiers, pikemen, spearmen, and the newly effective formations known as schiltrons. A schiltron was not an elegant unit, but it was terrifyingly effective, a tight circle or cluster of spearmen standing shoulder to shoulder, their long spears pointing outward like the quills of an iron hedgehog. Against a frontal charge of heavy cavalry, the schiltron was almost impregnable. The genius of the Scottish plan lay entirely in the terrain. The Scots deployed their army on the high, sloping ground north of the river, where they had an unbroken view of the English encampment. To reach them, the English had to cross the narrow wooden bridge. It was a catastrophic bottleneck, a perfect trap. The English commanders, however, were blinded by arrogance. Surrey, a veteran commander, correctly suggested a delay to find a wider ford or simply to outflank the Scots, but his advice was ignored. The treasurer, Cressingham, driven by an eagerness to save the king's money and finish the rebellion quickly, insisted on an immediate, direct assault across the narrow bridge. He would not waste time maneuvering against a rabble of farmers and outlaws. The English began to cross the bridge on the morning of September the 11th. It was a slow, tortuous process. The bridge was so narrow that the English knights, encased in their expensive armor, were forced to cross in a column that was perhaps only 10 feet wide. Only a few hundred men could reach the north bank before their path became fully clogged. This was the moment Wallace and Moray were waiting for. They watched the column inch forward, counting the men, waiting for the perfect number of English soldiers to be trapped between the river and the marshy ground. When the leading English ranks were fully across, and the bridge behind them was jammed with men and horses, Wallace gave the order. The Scottish schiltrons, led by Moray's disciplined forces, charged down the hill. Their assault was sudden, brutal, and perfectly timed. The English knights who had crossed were immediately cut off from the main body of their army. They found themselves pinned against the riverbank, unable to maneuver their horses or effectively deploy their weapons. Their heavy armor, a strength in an open field, became a leaden shroud on the slippery, marshy ground. The English on the north bank were annihilated in a sudden, concentrated massacre. The bridge, which should have been their highway to victory, became their gallows. Panic seized the English forces still waiting to cross. Surrey, watching his vanguard collapse into carnage, frantically tried to command a retreat, but it was too late. The bridge, already overloaded, collapsed under the weight of the desperate, retreating soldiers, dumping hundreds of knights and infantry into the river Forth to drown in their armor. The slaughter was absolute. The Scots had not merely won a battle, they had humiliated the greatest military power in Europe through pure strategic brilliance. Cressingham was among the dead. His body was later mutilated by the furious Scots, a testament to the hatred he inspired. This victory at Stirling Bridge was a military and psychological thunderclap. It proved the power of the schiltron and, more importantly, it proved that the English, despite their immense power, could be beaten. The outlaw William Wallace was no longer just a rebel. He was the most powerful man in Scotland. In the silence of Stirling Bridge's aftermath, the noise of shattered armor and dying men was replaced by the clatter of a pen. Wallace, the outlaw, now stood as the de facto ruler, his signature on official documents now carrying the weight of a reborn kingdom. But for every man who cheered, two nobles whispered treachery. The immediate effect of Stirling Bridge was the complete collapse of the English administration in Scotland. For the first time in years, Scotland was free of the English boot. William Wallace was the hero of the hour, but his victory brought with it a crippling reality. He now had to govern a devastated nation, and he had to prepare for the inevitable, terrifying retribution. His first necessary act was to secure the title that legitimized his command. Late in 1297, Wallace was knighted and appointed Guardian of Scotland in the name of the exiled King John Balliol. This was an astonishing rise. A man of the lesser gentry was now the supreme military and political commander of the nation. Wallace immediately set about consolidating his power, dealing with the most pressing problems, famine and international recognition. Wallace's response was audacious and brilliant. He led a large-scale retaliatory raid into northern England, specifically the counties of Northumberland and Durham. This successful incursion into enemy territory not only supplied Scotland with desperately needed provisions, but also served as a huge morale boost, reinforcing the idea that the Scots were now the aggressors, not merely the defenders. More critically, Wallace understood that military victory was useless without international recognition and trade. He dispatched envoys, carrying letters to the Hanseatic League, the powerful trading consortiums of the north. The most famous of these documents, the Lubeck and Hamburg letters, were formal notices declaring that Scotland was once again free and open for business. They are powerful evidence of Wallace's political vision, a testament that he was thinking beyond the next battle to the long-term restoration of his nation's economy and status. However, beneath the veneer of national unity, deep fissures remained. Wallace's status as a non-noble remained a source of festering resentment among the established Scottish nobility. Men like Robert the Bruce and John Comyn saw Wallace as an upstart, a dangerous commoner whose success threatened the entire feudal order they relied upon. The nobility's political maneuvering was constant and toxic. They were reluctant to fully commit their own forces to Wallace's army, choosing instead to bicker over precedence and power. They treated the defense of Scotland as a political bargaining chip rather than a national imperative. This wasn't just squabbling, it was a ticking clock. The nobles were already sharpening the knives for their own hero. This deep internal conflict meant that when the inevitable English counter-invasion came, Wallace would face it with an army weakened not just by lack of numbers, but by betrayal and deep-seated class division. This internal rot was the seed of Scotland's next tragedy, a vulnerability that Edward I was all too happy to exploit. The time of the Guardian's glory was drawing to a close, and the reckoning was about to arrive. Edward I was not a man of pity or patience. Hearing of Stirling's shame, he ceased his campaigns in France and returned home. His fury was not a roar, but the silent, terrifying preparation of a king whose honor had been stained. He would bring not just an army, but an iron fist to crush the Scottish rebellion once and for all. Edward I had been humiliated. The defeat at Stirling Bridge was a direct challenge to his personal claim of sovereignty over Scotland, and he could not allow it to stand. He cancelled his continental campaign, poured vast sums of money into his military machine, and prepared to march north in 1298. His response was overwhelming in its scale and determination. Edward assembled the largest army ever seen for an invasion of Scotland, a force that numbered at least 15,000 and potentially far higher. This was a king making a point. Scotland would be retaken, thoroughly and decisively. Crucially, Edward brought with him the latest in military technology and professional expertise, most notably thousands of highly effective Welsh longbowmen. These archers were specialized, disciplined soldiers who could fire at a rate of 10 to 12 arrows per minute, with enough power to pierce light armor. They represented a fundamental shift in warfare that made Wallace's schiltrons instantly obsolete. Wallace, fully aware of the magnitude of the threat, adopted the only viable strategy: scorched earth. He refused to engage in a pitched battle, withdrawing his forces into the interior and systematically destroying all crops, livestock, and supplies as he retreated. The aim was to starve the massive English army out of Scotland. If Edward's army could not resupply, it would be forced to retreat or disintegrate through disease and hunger. It was a grueling, unforgiving strategy that required enormous discipline from the Scottish people, but it was their only hope. For a time, the plan worked perfectly. The English march became a desperate struggle for survival. Edward's supply lines stretched to the breaking point, and his army was ravaged by hunger and low morale. His forces were on the brink of mutiny, and Edward himself considered abandoning the campaign, admitting defeat to a strategy of attrition. Wallace was winning the war of attrition. Yet, in one unguarded moment, a message was delivered to Edward that changed everything. The Scots had just run out of luck. Edward's fortunes changed. Either through a crucial failure in Wallace's intelligence network or, as some believe, an act of betrayal by the Scottish nobles, Edward received information regarding the location of Wallace's main army near the town of Falkirk. The intelligence reported that Wallace was camped and preparing for battle. Edward, desperate for a decisive victory to save his campaign, abandoned his retreat and force-marched his exhausted army toward the reported location. Wallace had been forced into an untenable position. The scorched earth strategy had failed to produce a full English retreat, and he was now compelled to fight a battle on ground not of his choosing against a far superior force. Edward I had achieved his goal. Wallace would fight, and the final reckoning was at hand. The two armies faced each other on the morning of July the 22nd, 1298, separated by a small stream and a gulf of tactical imbalance. Here is the second call to action. Share this video with any history lover in your life. They need to hear the real story behind this incredible hero. The morning mist over Falkirk revealed two armies separated by a small stream, but divided by a gulf in military science. Wallace's army stood firm, four great schiltrons immobile, impenetrable circles of vengeance. But the hammer of the Scots had brought a weapon that rendered their courage obsolete. Wallace's strategy at Falkirk was to rely entirely on the defensive strength that had won the day at Stirling, the schiltron. The Scottish army was deployed in four massive, tightly packed circles of spearmen. To reinforce this formation, Wallace ordered his men to drive stakes into the ground in front of the schiltrons, hoping to break the charge of the English heavy cavalry. It was a static, defiant, and ultimately doomed defensive posture. The battle began with the English cavalry charge. Edward's forces, still hungry but burning with the fury of their king, smashed into the Scottish flanks. The Scottish feudal cavalry, led by those very nobles who resented Wallace, proved utterly ineffective and quickly fled the field, leaving the schiltrons to stand alone, a likely act of deliberate betrayal that sealed the fate of the infantry. The English cavalry, unable to break the steel hedgehogs head-on, paused, forming a vast encircling ring around the Scottish infantry. The schiltrons had achieved the ultimate defensive position, but they were now entirely isolated. It was here that Edward introduced the element of modern military horror. He held his knights back and unleashed the Welsh longbowmen. The archers were positioned to fire volleys that arced high into the sky before descending upon the motionless Scottish ranks. This was the tragedy of Falkirk. The schiltrons, designed to withstand a frontal cavalry charge, had no defense against a projectile weapon that could be fired from a safe distance. The formation was a strength against a horse, but a perfect target for an arrow. The Welsh longbows unleashed a relentless, horrific and asymmetric fire. Arrows rained down on the Scottish army, turning the proud schiltrons into human pincushions. Men were pierced through gaps in their armor, struck in the face, and brought down by sheer volume of fire. They could do nothing but absorb the damage, their rigid formation preventing them from maneuvering or engaging their attackers. The air was filled with the sickening sound of thousands of shafts tearing through flesh and bone. The Scottish spearmen, heroes of Stirling, were reduced to suffering victims, their courage rendered obsolete by technology. When the Scottish ranks were sufficiently thinned, and the formations began to break under the combined psychological and physical pressure, Edward gave the order for the final, disciplined cavalry charge. The English knights crashed into the broken schiltrons, easily smashing through the remaining resistance. The battle quickly devolved into a massacre. Thousands of Scottish foot soldiers were slain in the field. Wallace's army had been utterly, crushingly defeated. Wallace managed to escape the carnage with a small, loyal corps of men, but the victory of the common man was over. The defeat was a total strategic failure, demonstrating that courage alone was no match for superior technology and unified command. In the immediate aftermath, William Wallace, the celebrated guardian of Scotland, resigned his post. His time as a military commander was done, his leadership proving too divisive for the fractured Scottish political scene. Under the banner of national necessity, Wallace had risen from a fugitive to a national leader, won the greatest victory in Scottish history, and suffered its most devastating defeat. The price of glory was the loss of his command. Yet, his legacy was secured not by his victories, but by his absolute refusal to submit. Wallace spent the next few years after Falkirk as a fugitive, traveling across Europe, pleading with the French king and the Pope for aid that never fully materialized. He was a symbol without an army, a legend in exile, hunted relentlessly by the English. Edward I knew that as long as Wallace lived and breathed, the spirit of Scottish independence remained alive. The hunt for the great outlaw finally ended in betrayal. In 1205, William Wallace was captured near Glasgow by a Scottish knight loyal to Edward, Sir John de Menteith. He was swiftly taken south to London to face a rigged trial for treason against a king he never recognized. Wallace famously retorted that he could not be a traitor to a king he had never sworn allegiance to. Despite his defiance, the outcome was predetermined. On August the 23rd, 1205, William Wallace was executed in London. His head was placed on a pike on London Bridge, and his limbs were displayed across the major cities of England and Scotland, a terrifying warning from the hammer of the Scots, but the warning failed. Edward I, in his fury, sought to crush a man, but instead created an immortal symbol. Wallace's head went onto a pike, but his spirit was picked up by Robert the Bruce, who would go on to defeat the hammer of the Scots. Wallace's true victory wasn't at Stirling, but in proving that freedom was a prize worth paying the ultimate price for. His story is a powerful reminder that history is not made by those in power, but often by the fierce, brave hearts of those who refuse to surrender. If you want to see more stories about the incredible people and battles that shaped our world, make sure to subscribe to our channel, comment below to tell us which historical figure we should cover next, and share this video with a friend. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next chapter of history.